In this video, we're going to be breaking down the Walker family murders. On the 19th of December, 1959, just 6 days before Christmas, 4 members of the Walker family were found dead in their small ranch home in Osprey, Florida. Cliff Walker, age 25, his wife Christine, age 24, and their 2 young children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie, had all been shot to death. Christine had been raped before being killed. The baby, Debbie, had also been drowned in the bathtub. This wasn't just murder. This was a complete family being wiped out in the most brutal way possible. Contextual overview. The Walkers lived on Palmer Ranch, a massive 14,000-acre cattle ranch in Osprey, Florida. Cliff worked there as a ranch hand, earning $55 a week, managing herds of deep red cows. The job came with a small, white, wood frame house where the family lived. Their nearest neighbor was half a mile away, which meant they lived in pretty serious isolation. Christine was known as bubbly and spirited, the kind of person who could get along with anyone. She was a Sunday school teacher at their local church and a devoted mother. Cliff was more quiet, the opposite of his wife's personality. He spent most of his time on horseback, working the ranch. He wore straw cowboy hats and dreamed of becoming a pilot one day. Despite their differences, they had been married for 5 years and seemed happy together. The couple had 2 little kids. Jimmy was 3 years old, full of energy like most toddlers. Debbie was barely 2 years old, still a baby really. The family was well liked in their community. They were regular churchgoers, active in local events, and known for their kindness. Nobody had anything bad to say about the Walkers. They were just a normal American family trying to make a living in rural Florida. The day before the murders, December 18th, Christine wrote a letter to her mother. She was excited about seeing her for Christmas and mentioned she had something important to tell her when she arrived. We'll never know what that something was. She also told her mother and mother-in-law that Cliff had been in a fight recently and had almost been killed. This detail would become important later when investigators tried to figure out who might have wanted to hurt the family. Build up. Saturday, the 19th of December, 1959, started as a normal day for the Walker family. They had errands to run, so they loaded up the kids and drove about a dozen miles north to Sarasota. This wasn't just a casual trip. Cliff wanted to trade in Christine's 1952 Plymouth for something newer. They were looking at cars, which is a big deal for a family making $55 a week. At one car lot, Cliff looked at a 2-tone 1956 Chevrolet 210. At another dealership, he test drove a Hudson Jet. The family also stopped for lunch. Cliff bought cigarettes while the kids got candy. They were having a normal family day out. At one point, one of the children dropped the car keys, so they had to go back to the dealership to get them. These small details paint a picture of an ordinary Saturday. Around 3:30 p.m., they finished their errands and headed back to the ranch. They stopped at the ranch barn to pick up cattle feed. Cliff and his co-worker, Don McLeod, made plans to go hog hunting the next morning. Christine stayed back and chatted with McLeod's wife for a bit. Then, around 4 p.m., Christine headed home first in their car. Cliff and the kids followed about half an hour later in his work Jeep. Christine arrived home alone and had time to put away the groceries they had bought. She was in the house by herself, probably getting things ready for dinner, when someone entered the home. It could have been someone already hiding inside, or someone who knocked on the door. We don't know for sure. But what happened next was absolutely terrible. When Christine's attacker confronted her, she fought back hard. She used her high-heeled shoes as weapons, fighting so fiercely that she actually got blood on her shoes, the attacker's blood. But her fight wasn't enough. The attacker overpowered her, raped her, and then shot her in the head. She was killed with a .22 caliber gun. Her body was found lying in a pool of blood near the doorway to the living room. She was barefoot, bruised, and bloody, her pink flowered dress pulled up, her slips and petticoats in a mess. About 30 minutes after Christine arrived home, Cliff pulled up in his work Jeep with Jimmy and Debbie. He had no idea what he was walking into. The moment he entered the house, someone ambushed him. Cliff was shot in the right eye, killed instantly. His body fell in the living room, and he was still wearing his straw cowboy hat when he was found. 3-year-old Jimmy saw his father get killed. The little boy somehow crawled over to his dad's body. Blood was smeared on his clothes and in his hair. Then the killer shot him 3 times in the head. A 3-year-old child was shot 3 times. The killer showed absolutely no mercy. Baby Debbie was the last to die. The killer shot her, but she didn't die right away. So the killer took the baby to the bathroom, put her in the bathtub with about 4 inches of water, and drowned her. She was found face down in the water. A 1-year-old baby, drowned in a bathtub after being shot. The level of evil and coldness required to do this is almost impossible to understand. The crime scene told a story of pure violence. 2 different handguns were used, both .22 caliber weapons. The killer left behind some clues: a bloody cowboy boot print, a fingerprint on the bathtub faucet handle, and a cellophane strip from a cool cigarette wrapper. There was also semen on Christine's underwear, which would become crucial evidence decades later. But here's something strange that made investigators think the killer knew the family. Several personal items were missing from the house. The killer took Cliff's pocket knife, Christine's high school majorette uniform, and most oddly, the couple's marriage certificate. Why would a random robber take a marriage certificate? Why would they take a high school uniform? These weren't valuable items you could sell. This suggested the killer had some kind of personal connection to the family, especially to Christine. Outside, there was even more evidence that the killer knew the area. Bloody clothing that had been used to partially clean up the crime scene was found in a shed near the Walker property. The killer knew that shed was there. This wasn't someone just passing through. Gifts were already under the Christmas tree. The family had been preparing for Christmas, just like millions of other American families. And now they were all dead, their blood staining the floors of their small ranch house. Immediate aftermath. The next morning, the 20th of December 1959, started normally for Don McLeod. He was supposed to go hog hunting with Cliff, so he drove to the Walker house around sunrise to pick him up. But when he arrived, something felt wrong immediately. The house was completely dark. There was no movement. No sounds of a family with young children getting ready for the day. The Walkers were always early risers, and their house was usually full of activity. McLeod knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked louder. Still nothing. His gut told him something was seriously wrong. He cut through the screen door and entered the house. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Christine was lying in the doorway to the living room in a pool of blood. In the corner, he saw Cliff and Jimmy, both shot in the head. McLeod couldn't find Debbie at first. He quickly left to call the police, his mind trying to process what he had just seen. When police arrived and searched the house, they found little Debbie in the bathtub. The sight of a drowned baby in the bathroom was something even experienced officers struggled to handle. News of the murders spread through Osprey like wildfire. Within hours, a crush of cars crawled down the Shell Road just to see where the family had lived. People were in shock. Murder just didn't happen in their quiet community, and certainly not the murder of an entire family, including 2 small children. The brutality of it shook everyone to their core. The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office launched a full investigation immediately. Sheriff Ross Boyer believed they were looking for someone local. His reasoning was simple. Why kill the children unless the killer could be recognized? If it was just a robbery gone wrong, why murder 2 toddlers? They couldn't identify anyone. The only reason to kill them would be if they knew the attacker. Investigators interviewed everyone they could find. They looked at Cliff's co-workers, neighbors, family members, and anyone who had contact with the Walkers. The community, which usually trusted everyone, suddenly became filled with suspicion. Neighbors started suspecting neighbors. Family members pointed fingers at each other. One of Cliff's cousins, Elbert Walker, came under suspicion because of his strange behavior. He grew hysterical outside the Walker gate when he learned of the deaths, and actually fainted at the funeral. Was this genuine grief, or was it guilt? Investigators couldn't tell. Don McLeod, the man who found the bodies, was also questioned extensively, but he had an alibi, and had been genuinely helpful. He mentioned something important though. He had seen their neighbor, Wilbur Tooker, at the Walker house at least 24 times. This neighbor, Wilbur Tooker, quickly became a person of interest. Tooker was 65 years old, a retired railroad worker. but age hadn't stopped him from making unwanted advances toward Christine. He had hit on her multiple times, touched her inappropriately, and made her uncomfortable. Christine had rejected him repeatedly. Cliff knew about this and had even threatened Tooker to stay away from his wife. Another neighbor had seen Tooker in the area on the afternoon of the murders. He had a clear interest in Christine. He lived nearby and knew the area well. But Tooker had an alibi for most of the evening. He had played violin at a concert in Bradenton. According to the conductor, he played badly, but he was definitely there. Still, this didn't account for the earlier hours when the murders likely occurred. The investigation also revealed something disturbing about Christine's life in the community. Even after she married Cliff, at least 6 different men had propositioned her, patted her rear, grabbed her, or tried to kiss her, especially when they had been drinking, which was often. Christine was an attractive, friendly woman, and apparently, some men in the area saw that as an invitation. She wasn't safe in her own community. On the night of the murders, at least 7 men had been fishing at a nearby creek. Another 3 were seen drinking on the road leading to the Walker's house. Any of them could have seen Christine arrive home alone and decided to act on whatever twisted thoughts they'd been having. The sheriff's office was overwhelmed with leads, tips, and potential suspects. Dozens of residents handed over their guns so investigators could check if the firing pin left the same marks on shell casings as those found at the crime scene. Everyone wanted to help, or at least appear helpful. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Long-term repercussions. As weeks turned into months, the investigation ran into walls. Despite having physical evidence, the fingerprint, the boot print, the cigarette wrapper, and the DNA evidence, investigators couldn't match any of it to a specific person. The case grew cold, but it never died completely. Then, something unexpected happened. Just 34 days before the Walker murders, another family had been brutally murdered in Kansas. On the 15th of November, 1959, Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their 2 teenage children, Nancy and Kenyon, were found shot to death in their farmhouse in Holcomb, Kansas. All 4 had been killed with shotgun blasts to the head after being bound. The killers were 2 ex-convicts named Richard Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. They had broken into the Clutter home, believing there was a safe full of money. When they found no safe and only about $50, they killed the entire family anyway. They fled to Florida in a stolen 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air. This is where things get interesting. Hickok and Smith were seen in Florida around the time of the Walker murders. They checked into a Miami Beach hotel, which is about 4 hours from Osprey, and checked out on the morning of December 19, the same day the Walkers were killed. Witnesses spotted them at a department store in Sarasota, just a few miles from the Walker home, on December 19. One witness even noticed that one of them had scratches on his face. Scratches that could have come from Christine fighting back with her shoes. Here's the really interesting part. The Walkers had been shopping for a 1956 Chevrolet, the exact make and model that Hickok and Smith were driving. Investigators believe this is how the killers gained entry to the Walker home. They might have knocked on the door and offered to sell the car, and Christine, not knowing who they were, let them inside. Hickok and Smith were arrested in Las Vegas on the 30th of December, 1959, for the Clutter murders. They were tried, convicted, and hanged on the 14th of April, 1965. Before their execution, they were questioned about the Walker murders. They both took polygraph tests, which they supposedly passed. This seemed to clear them. But there's a problem with this. Polygraph machines in the early 1960 seconds were notoriously unreliable. Many experts now say those results don't mean much. Plus, writer Truman Capote, who wrote the famous book In Cold Blood about the Clutter murders, dismissed the possibility that Hickok and Smith killed the Walkers. He claimed they had alibis. But when investigators looked more closely at Capote's claims, they found contradictions and errors. Capote might have gotten some facts wrong, or maybe he deliberately left things out to make his story cleaner. Kansas authorities had actually considered Hickok and Smith suspects in the Walker case as far back as 1960. The FBI and local investigators knew there was a connection, but without solid proof, they couldn't make a case stick. Both men went to the gallows swearing they only killed the Clutters. One strange confession came from a serial killer named Emmett Monroe Spencer, who claimed he killed the Walker family. But Sheriff Boyer quickly figured out that Spencer was lying. The confession was cleverly constructed from details Spencer had read in newspapers and true crime books. He was labeled a pathological liar, and his confession was dismissed. Over the decades, the Walker case consumed detective after detective. Each one would dive into the files, chase leads, interview people, and eventually burn out. The case had over 600 suspects at various times. That's how many people were considered as possibly being involved. From local ranch hands to distant criminals, everyone was looked at. In 2012, more than 50 years after the murders, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office decided to take another shot at solving the case. Advances in DNA technology had made it possible to extract information from old evidence that couldn't be analyzed before. They focused on Hickok and Smith. In December 2012, the bodies of Hickok and Smith were exhumed from Mount Muncie Cemetery in Kansas. It was a big operation, carefully done to preserve any DNA that might still exist in their bones. Bone fragments were collected from their skeletal remains. The hope was that DNA from the bones could be matched to the semen found on Christine's underwear. The entire investigation waited for months for the results. When they finally came in August 2013, they were devastating. The DNA tests were inconclusive. Only partial DNA could be retrieved from the bones, possibly because of degradation over the decades or contamination in storage. The samples were too degraded to make a definitive match. This didn't mean Hickok and Smith were innocent. It just meant the DNA couldn't prove they were guilty. Investigators still believe they remain the most viable suspects. They were in Florida at the right time, in the right area, driving the right car, and one of them had scratches on his face. Plus, Hickok's philosophy was reportedly to leave no witnesses, which is exactly what happened to the Walker family. But not everyone agrees with this theory. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist from DeSales University, looked at the case and came to a different conclusion. She believes the personal items that were stolen, the marriage certificate, the majorette uniform, the pocket knife, suggest the killer knew the family. These aren't things a random drifter would take. These are things someone with an emotional connection would want as keepsakes or trophies. In 2013, something weird happened. The Walker's marriage certificate, which had been reported stolen, turned up among items given to Cliff Walker's niece by a relative. This relative became a suspect, but DNA testing later proved they were innocent. In 2019, new investigators conducted more DNA testing on the evidence. They found DNA from 2 people on Christine's underwear, 1 male and 1 female. But the mixture was too complex to identify specific individuals. The female DNA was likely Christine's own, but the male DNA remained a mystery. This is when William Tooker, the creepy neighbor, became a focus again. The DNA testing showed that Tooker could not be ruled out as a contributor to the DNA mixture. He had been in the area that afternoon. He had a crush on Christine that she didn't return. He knew the family and the property. But Tooker died in 1963 of a heart attack while playing violin, so he could never be questioned further or conclusively linked to the crime. In July 2023, in a last-ditch effort to solve the case, the bodies of Cliff and Christine Walker were exhumed from Oak Ridge Cemetery in Arcadia, Florida. Their brother, Pat Myers, who was Christine's half-brother, had been pushing for this for over 15 years. The hope was that by getting Christine's DNA profile, they could remove her DNA from the mixture found on her underwear and clearly identify the male contributor. Pat Myers was just 7 years old when his sister was murdered. A neighbor burst into his living room to tell him what had happened. For over 60 years, he has fought for answers. He drops by the sheriff's office regularly, keeps pressure on investigators, and refuses to let his sister's case be forgotten. He's now in his 72nd and knows time is running out to get justice for his family. The problem with cold cases like this is a matter of priority. What does society owe to victims from 65 years ago? Many law enforcement experts say resources should go to cases where an arrest can actually be made. With Hickok and Smith dead, with Tooker dead, With most of the original suspects either dead or very old, what's the point of continuing the investigation? But for families like Pat Myers, it's not about making an arrest. It's about knowing the truth. It's about being able to say definitively who killed their loved ones. It's about justice, even if it comes too late for a trial. The national homicide clearance rate shows how hard this is getting. In 1965, the year Hickok and Smith were executed, law enforcement agencies closed 90% of homicides. By 2020, that rate had dropped to 54%. More than half of murders now go unsolved. Experts blame budget cuts, lack of dedicated cold case units, and hundreds of unsolved serial killer cases that tie up resources. The Walker family murders remain officially unsolved. The case file is still open in Sarasota County. It's one of 32 cold cases the agency is working on, ranging from 1,959 to 2,019. But unlike newer cases, there's no physical evidence that clearly points to a living suspect. The fingerprint found on the bathtub faucet has never been matched. The boot print led nowhere. The DNA is too mixed to be definitive. Every few years, someone takes another look at the case. A new detective gets interested. A new DNA technique becomes available. A tip comes in from someone who heard a deathbed confession or found old letters, but so far, nothing has cracked the case. The Walker family murders changed Osprey forever. The small, tight-knit community lost its innocence that December day in 1959. People started locking their doors. They stopped trusting strangers. They looked at their neighbors differently. The fear never fully went away. For true crime enthusiasts and amateur detectives, the Walker case remains one of the most fascinating unsolved mysteries in American history. It has everything: a brutal crime, multiple viable suspects, a possible connection to one of the most famous murders in literary history, and decades of failed investigations. It's been featured in the New York Times, on CBS News, and has its own Wikipedia page. The case also raises questions about the justice system and how we handle cold cases. Should DNA testing be used to solve crimes where everyone involved is dead? Is it worth spending money and resources on a 5-year-old murder? What do we owe to victims' families? These are questions without easy answers. Some people believe the murders will never be solved. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence has degraded. Too many people have died. The truth might have died with Hickok and Smith on those gallows in 1965, or with Tooker when his heart gave out in 1963, or with some other suspect who took the secret to their grave. Others hold out hope. DNA technology keeps improving. Maybe one day they'll be able to extract better samples from the evidence. Maybe someone will come forward with information. Maybe a relative of a suspect will agree to DNA testing and provide the missing link. Maybe, just maybe, the Walker family will finally get justice. What we do know for certain is this: on the 19th of December 1959, 4 innocent people were brutally murdered in their home. A hard-working ranch hand who dreamed of flying, a bubbly Sunday school teacher who was loved by everyone, a 3-year-old boy who crawled to his dying father, a baby girl who was drowned in a bathtub. They were preparing for Christmas. They were living normal lives, and someone took all of that away in an act of pure evil. The Walker family murders stand as one of Florida's oldest and most haunting cold cases. More than 65 years later, their killer has never been definitively identified. The case remains a mystery, a puzzle with pieces that don't quite fit together, a tragedy without a final chapter. 4 lives were stolen, a family was destroyed, and somewhere, someone got away with murder. On the 19th of December 1959, the entire Walker family was brutally murdered in their Osprey, Florida home. Cliff Walker, 25, his wife, Christine, 24, and their 2 young children, Jimmy, 3, and Debbie, 1, were all shot to death. Christine was raped before being killed, and baby Debbie was also drowned in the bathtub. The family had spent the day car shopping in Sarasota. Christine arrived home first around 4 p.m. and was attacked. When Cliff returned with the kids 30 minutes later, they were all killed. A coworker found their bodies the next morning. The main suspects are Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, the infamous in cold blood killers who murdered the Clutter family in Kansas just 34 days earlier. They were in Florida at the time, seen near the Walker home, and driving a 1956 Chevrolet the Walkers wanted to buy. However, DNA tests in 2013 were inconclusive. Another theory focuses on neighbor William Tooker, who had made unwanted advances toward Christine and couldn't be ruled out by DNA testing. Despite 600-plus suspects exhuming bodies for DNA testing, both the killers in 2012 and the Walkers in 2023, and 65-plus years of investigation, the case remains unsolved, one of Florida's oldest cold cases. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.